This episode is brought to you by Jimmy's Guns and Stuff. Come on down to our new Cinderac City location and get yourself some 357 rounds, as well as a jacket to keep the dust off your back. Jimmy's Guns and Stuff. It's where I buy all my guns and most of my stuff. Hey there, scabby scummers and gangers. Crimson Oracle here, another edition of Battlefield on a Budget. This time, I'm going to be showing you the process by which I made my Rolling Roads board, which is the most modular of an outdoor board that I've done. Of course, the 1 foot by 1 foot terrain tiles that I do for the Underhive are extremely modular, but for doing large outdoor tiles, I almost always stick to doing 2x2 or 3x3, stuff like that. And this time I did a 1 foot by 3 foot tile to represent the road sections, which is a very different style than what I've done in the past. And this is for obvious reasons if you know about the Rolling Road scenarios. After each turn, the board is reduced by 8 inches. You're generally supposed to move everything back 8 inches, but I wanted a board that would be conducive to moving everything back and not having to actually measure and shift every piece of terrain and vehicle and model on the board, because that is kind of, a pain. So what I did was make 6 1x3 sections. Now, of course, you're supposed to move things 8 inches. So for these, you wind up removing a board, every 2 boards every 3 turns, essentially. And I find that it works very well. It's, in my opinion, a better system for doing it than the sort of recommended way. Of course, it's a compromise anytime you are trying to represent a larger area than your play surface. In this case, it means that after turn 1, the first 8 inches are unused, and then turn 2, the first 4 inches are unused after you take the board off at the start of turn 3. And then, of course, at the end of turn 3, then you've taken 2 boards off because that's 24 inches. So obviously this is, a compromise, and it's mostly because I didn't want to do 8-inch sections. I already felt like 12 by 3 was getting things small enough. I didn't want to go any smaller. That's just me. Omar, chill. My cat is harassing me, of course. Now, anytime you're dealing with a terrain surface or, a play surface, you're going to have to make a choice between portability and durability, between cost and, accessibility or whatever. So in this case, I went with a very affordable build material, and it will produce a less durable board than if you were to do a few extra steps. So for example, if you were to take a very thin plywood, cut it down, and then glue the foam to the plywood, that would produce a board that holds its shape better. It's less likely to warp, it's less likely to break or be otherwise damaged, but as a cost, it becomes heavier. Personally, I went with just the pure foam as the board itself, because I wanted to do it as affordably as possible, but also because I wanted to make sure that it was as light as possible because I'm transporting this stuff around a lot. I did, of course, use a lot of my texture paste that I use in a lot of my builds. You can see that up here in this video that I showed how I make it. I just used a lot greater quantities. I bought a giant tub of cheap, ugly flock. You can get the ugliest shades of flock for the cheapest prices, and it doesn't really matter because you're going to be covering everything in paint anyway. Don't overspend on that expensive, high-end basing material when the cheap stuff will fill in the gaps with the glue significantly more efficiently. So overall, I think the board probably costs around $40, and that's assuming, of course, that you're buying your sand not at the bulk prices, but at the sort of smaller craft store prices that I pay, because I don't want to deal with having big sacks of sand lying around my house. My next video is going to show off the other ash waste board that I made, because when I went to the store to get the insulation foam, I had this thought that it just made a lot more sense to get both, to get two and to try two different builds, just in case I wasn't happy with how the road sections worked. It turns out that I am. I'm very happy. Having played on the board a few times now, it is a lot of fun, and I think it's very thematic for the ash waste, so I'm excited to show it off. And then after that, I'm going to show how I do the posters for all of the terrain that I'm going to be putting on in the intervening time. And at that, I will be finally done with the first series of the Battlefield on a Budget videos. I will, of course, be continuing the series with a series of Into the Underhive builds. So we are going to tackle the topic of zone mortalis scenery using foam and foam core and other household items to make yourself some, some catacombs. Now that we've built, big outdoor industrial tanks to scatter across our ash waste battlefields, it's time to go inside and go exploring. All right, with that, let's move on to the video. This build makes extensive use of the thin cardboard from cereal boxes and other retail packaging, and needlepoint mesh, which is that plastic mesh that is used for doing needlepoint work. I have a habit of just buying a ton of it because it is so useful. It is great as grading and various other things, and as you'll see in a moment, I use it to represent the sort of underneath of the roadway surface. Whatever paving process they use relies on some kind of a grid underneath that the road surface adheres to. So in the gaps between the surfaces, I am placing chunks of, damaged grading. And that creates this impression that there is, that this surface, this roadway is, part of a real structure and sort of chipping away. And then the texture paints will fill in those kind of gaps and distances, and it will make it all look very, kind of authentic, like a roadway. And of course, I glue down the various bits of plastic first and then cover the cardboard in glue. And then I am going to use some weights, some cans from the cabinet in order to weigh it down, because that cardboard is very susceptible to, water and will start to curl up at the edges if you don't weigh it down. Now, of course, when you're cutting this kind of damage into the surface that you're working on, you are going to create little bits that stick up. That part is actually kind of okay. You just need to make sure to bring in the plastic underneath and the texture paint to kind of make it look like it is, naturally lifting off, this little bit kind of coming off and creating some three-dimensionality to it. But you want to make sure to get it, relatively flat so that everything can stack without issue. And of course, the same process is repeated across these boards. I don't show you every single bit of it because it would be kind of repetitive. So of course, now is the point where I start to apply the texture paste. It's important to put this on kind of at varying degrees of thickness, but you're going to want to really layer it on, because this is both going to make it easier for your paint to stick to the board. It's also going to really create the sort of three-dimensionality that you need to sell this as, an actual space in the ash waste. You'll see I am using a crappy paintbrush to do all of this. I find that a paintbrush is nice because it can kind of move the liquid around through absorption and help to ensure that everything is kind of nice and even. So I of course do this on all of the boards, and it's important when you're doing the borders with the road to kind of show the infiltration of the sand and muck onto the roadway. But I like to then do a very, very thin coating on the actual road surface. And I find that when you do a thin coating and then you paint it differently, it gives the impression of a paved road, which is a really nice effect, especially once you start dry brushing and you kind of bring that texture out. To do the painting for this project, I used the auto primer that I get at the hardware store, and I used a gray for the road surface, and then I used a brown with a white sprayed over top as the actual ash roadway. This provided some undershading, which I found helpful when applying washes later. Honestly, this process was a lot of fun, and the board looked pretty good when I was done, and you could probably get away with doing it with just spray paint and not bothering with any washes. Of course, I did bother with washes. I made my own washes using a sepia ink for the ash like waste surface and a black ink wash for the road surface. This gave everything a nice bit of depth. I didn't get video of it, but I also dry brushed the surface for a little bit and then found that it was kind of a lot. So I wound up using another coat of paint from the rattle can in order to put down the final layers on the board. I haven't added it yet, but I definitely can recommend putting down a layer of varnish on top, as it will help keep everything in place and more secure. Thanks to my patrons for helping me make this content viewable by everyone. You guys are the real heroes. If anyone's interested in becoming a patron of this show, you can do so for as little as $2 a month. Just hop on over to patreon.com/thedomerunners. And of course, if you enjoy this show, you may like my podcast, The Dome Runners, which you can find on Buzzsprout. And with that, everybody, of course, stay safe and don't forget to change your paint water.